The invaders came without warning. They arrived in silent, monstrous ships, blotting out the stars above humanity's outermost colonies. The Zal Zerth, an empire that had crushed hundreds of civilizations beneath its clawed feet, assumed this war would be like all the others, a short, brutal extermination. They were wrong. The first colony fell within hours, its defenses shattered by orbital bombardment. The second fought longer, its militia desperately holding the line until their weapons overheated and their bodies gave out. The third was where things changed. New Avalon. A prosperous world, rich in resources and culture, it had no standing army, no warships, no defenses beyond a few police drones. When the Zal Zerth landed, they expected frightened cattle. Instead, they found rage. The humans of New Avalon did not beg for mercy. They did not surrender. They fought tooth and nail, barricading streets, turning mining equipment into weapons, and rigging entire city blocks to explode. For 3 weeks, the Zal Zerth slaughtered them by the thousands, their reptilian generals growing frustrated at the sheer stubbornness of their prey. The humans fought even as their cities burned, as their skies turned black with smoke. Yet it was never a question of if New Avalon would fall. Only when. But then, the skies darkened for another reason. At first, the Zal Zerth thought it was an eclipse, a cosmic anomaly, something natural. Then the thunder came. The first orbital strike hit the Zal Zerth command ship like a divine hammer. Its shields collapsed in an instant, and in the next, a blinding lance of energy split it in two. The ground beneath the invaders trembled as the air filled with sonic booms. The sky tore open, revealing monstrous black-armored warships descending from the heavens. The dreadnoughts had arrived. Each one was a city of death, bristling with railguns the size of skyscrapers and missile bays that could reduce continents to rubble. Their hulls bore the scars of 100 wars, yet they moved with terrifying purpose. From their bellies, dropships poured out like swarming locusts, descending upon the ruined streets of New Avalon. And from those dropships came them, the Terran Marines. 8 feet tall in powered armor, their visors glowed with the cold, mechanical rage of their kind. Their weapons did not fire projectiles, they launched devastation. The Zal Zerth, the conquerors of 1,000 worlds, finally felt what it was to be prey. They had believed humanity was weak, a fledgling race, barely out of their cradle. But they had forgotten one truth, one whispered legend among the few species who had survived war with mankind. If you strike at humanity, then God help you when their war machines arrive. And as the dreadnoughts rained fire upon the invaders, as the Terran Marines crushed them beneath their boots, as the last surviving Zal Zerth general screamed into the void for mercy. No one answered. Only death remained. The Zal Zerth had never known fear like this. Their empire had conquered and annihilated over 100 species. They had burned planets, crushed rebellions, and turned entire civilizations into footnotes in history. But nothing had prepared them for humanity's wrath. New Avalon's ruins trembled as the dreadnoughts opened fire from orbit, their mass drivers launching hypervelocity rounds that tore apart Zal Zerth landing craft before they could flee. Any warships that attempted to escape were shredded by precision railgun fire. On the ground, the Terran Marines moved like specters of death. They advanced through the ruined streets with ruthless efficiency, their towering power armor built for destruction. Their weapons, each one more powerful than the heaviest ordnance in the Zal Zerth arsenal, ripped through their enemies as if their vaunted armor was made of paper. A Zal Zerth warrior, standing over 7 feet tall with scaled muscle honed for war, lunged at one of the human giants. It swung its plasma blade down, expecting to cleave through armor. The Marine barely flinched. He caught the alien's arm mid-strike, crushing bone and scale with one hand before driving his fist into its skull. The Zal Zerth's head exploded in a spray of greenish blood. The others hesitated. The conquerors of 100 species hesitated. The Marine took a step forward, and in a voice that rumbled like a god's judgment, he spoke one word. "Run!" Panic spread through the Zal Zerth forces like wildfire. Their commanders screamed at them to hold position, but it was useless. Their carefully planned invasion had turned into a nightmare. The humans were not fighting for territory. They were not even fighting for revenge. They were erasing them. A Zal Zerth officer, one of the few still trying to maintain order, barked orders into his comms. "Send reinforcements! We need air support!" He never finished. A railgun round punched through his body, tearing him apart before detonating a plasma charge behind him. The entire street lit up in a blue fireball. Above, a Terran gunship swooped through the sky, its engines roaring. It rained death upon the fleeing aliens, autocannons shredding those who tried to escape the massacre. The Zal Zerth fleet in orbit had already been crippled. Their invasion force was being butchered. And then, the final horror arrived. From the lead dreadnought, a transmission echoed across the battlefield. A voice. Cold. Calculated. Filled with the fury of a species that had been underestimated for too long. "This is Admiral Cain of the Terran Federation Navy. Your forces have invaded sovereign human space. You will receive no mercy. You will not be given the chance to retreat. You will burn." And then the exterminators deployed. These were not Marines. These were something else, something worse. 10 feet tall in exoskeletal armor, their weapons vaporized anything they touched. Their mere presence sent a cold terror through even the most battle-hardened Zal Zerth warriors. They were the ones sent when humanity wanted a war to end. When the Zal Zerth High Command received the footage, what little of it remained, they did something they had never done before. They ordered a full retreat, not a strategic withdrawal, not a regrouping maneuver. They fled. The Zal Zerth Empire had learned too late. Some species cowered when invaded. Some surrendered. Humanity? Humanity didn't just fight back. They ended you. The Zal Zerth forces tried to retreat. Tried. Their last remaining warships in orbit activated emergency jump drives, desperate to escape the massacre below. But the humans had anticipated this. "Target their FTL drives," Admiral Cain commanded. "No one leaves." From the dreadnoughts, beams of concentrated energy lanced through the darkness. Zal Zerth ships, already battered and burning, had their engines carved out like tumors. Their escape routes became death traps, their desperate attempts to flee turning into slow, agonizing destruction as human warships picked them apart. One after another, the Zal Zerth vessels exploded, their debris joining the graveyard of ships now orbiting New Avalon. For the first time in their history, the Zal Zerth had encountered an enemy that did not simply repel them. Humanity didn't just win wars. They erased the concept of their enemy's victory from existence. But the worst was yet to come. The exterminators marched through the city ruins, their armor gleaming under the firelit sky. They did not speak. They did not take prisoners. They only hunted. A surviving Zal Zerth officer, one of the few who had managed to regroup, hid behind a crumbling building, watching in horror. His warriors, once proud conquerors, now scrambled like vermin, gunned down one by one. A nearby comrade, a younger warrior, trembled. "Commander, what do we do?" The officer swallowed, his throat dry. "We surrender." The words tasted like ash. His people had never surrendered before. It was unthinkable, unacceptable. But as he watched a single exterminator tear through a Zal Zerth heavy unit with his bare hands, ripping its reinforced armor open like paper, he knew they had no choice. He activated his communicator, broadcasting on all frequencies. "This is Commander Zora of the Zal Zerth invasion fleet. We surrender." "We surrender!" The battlefield fell silent. The remaining Zal Zerth forces dropped their weapons, kneeling on shattered streets, hands raised. For a brief moment, hope flickered in the commander's heart. Perhaps the humans would show mercy. Then the reply came. It was not Admiral Cain who responded. It was a woman's voice, cold, calm, and merciless. "Surrender?" A pause. "No." And then the exterminators opened fire. They didn't hesitate. They didn't stop. They executed the Zal Zerth with terrifying efficiency. No survivors, no prisoners, no chance. Commander Zora barely had time to scream before a plasma round vaporized his skull. The last of the invaders died choking on their own blood, their bodies left where they fell. New Avalon was stained green with Zal Zerth blood, and humanity did not mourn them. This wasn't just revenge. This was a message. Days later, the Zal Zerth homeworld received the transmission. Their emperor, once feared across the stars, watched in horror as Admiral Cain's face appeared on the screen. "This was your only warning," he said. "You came to our worlds, you slaughtered our people, and now you know the cost." Behind him, footage of the extermination played. Zal Zerth bodies, burned and broken, their warships reduced to drifting wrecks, their warriors, mighty conquerors, hunted like animals. Admiral Cain leaned forward, his gaze like a blade. "If you so much as breathe in the direction of humanity again, we will not stop at your fleet. We will come for your worlds, we will come for your cities, and we will turn your entire species into a memory." The transmission cut. Silence fell in the Zal Zerth war room. The Emperor, a being who had once commanded the death of billions without hesitation, trembled. For the first time in their empire's history, they knew fear. And across the galaxy, whispers spread among alien nations. The humans, the species once ignored as weak, had proven something terrifying. They were not just survivors. They were the monsters that nightmares feared. The Zal Zerth Empire teetered on the edge of collapse. News of the massacre at New Avalon spread faster than any official announcement. The sheer brutality of humanity's response sent shockwaves through the Empire's war councils. Entire fleets went silent. Generals refused orders. The Emperor himself had retreated into isolation, his advisors whispering of unprecedented surrender negotiations, an act that had never been considered in Zal Zerth history. But it wasn't just the Zal Zerth who were watching. Across the galaxy, other empires, many of them once salivating at the thought of carving up humanity's colonies for themselves, suddenly found themselves rethinking their ambitions. The Varathi Dominion, whose insectoid warriors had long prided themselves on their insatiable expansion, abruptly withdrew their border fleets from human space. The Kalath Syndicate, a crime empire that had trafficked in human slaves for years, suddenly ceased all human trade overnight. Their stations quietly vanished from known space, their leaders going into hiding. Even the Seraphi Concordat, an advanced, isolationist race that had long deemed humanity too primitive for diplomacy, opened communication channels with the Terran Federation for the first time in history. One thing was clear: the humans had changed the rules. But humanity wasn't finished. Admiral Cain stood aboard the bridge of the TFS Judicator, his flagship Dreadnought, as the final reports from New Avalon scrolled across his display. 0 Zal Zerth survivors, 0 human civilian casualties post-liberation, 0 enemy warships allowed to escape, a perfect, absolute victory. He had made his message clear. Humanity would not be prey, not now, not ever again. But now, there was a decision to make. Behind him, Grand Strategist Vera Lynn, one of the most feared tacticians in the Federation, spoke coldly. "We should finish them." Cain turned to her. "They're already broken." Lynn's expression remained unreadable. "Not broken enough. Their Emperor still breathes. Their fleet, though wounded, still exists. If we stop now, in a century, maybe 2, they might return." She leaned in. "Or we could ensure they never do." There was no hesitation in her voice, no cruelty, just pragmatism. Cain exhaled. He had known this was coming, knew the War Council would demand total extermination, and part of him agreed. But another part, buried deep, wondered if this was the line, the moment where humanity crossed into something else. The Zal Zerth had made their choice when they invaded. They had sought to exterminate humanity. Now humanity had to decide. Would they simply defeat their enemies, or would they become something far worse? Cain turned to the holomap, where the Zal Zerth homeworld gleamed in the darkness like a ripe fruit waiting to be crushed. One order, one command, and an empire would cease to exist. And all across the bridge, his officers awaited his decision. Would humanity's vengeance end here? Or would the skies above the Zal Zerth homeworld darken next? Cain took a breath. Then he gave the order. The bridge of the TFS Judicator was silent. The weight of history hung heavy in the air as Admiral Cain's voice echoed through the command deck. "Deploy the fleet. We end this." Across the vastness of space, the Terran Federation's war machine roared to life. Hundreds of ships, dreadnoughts, battleships, destroyers, formed up in perfect precision, their massive engines burning like dying stars. At the heart of the formation, 3 of humanity's most terrifying weapons loomed. The Purifiers. They were not ships. They were judgment given form. Colossal mobile weapons platforms designed for planetary annihilation. They carried no troops, no diplomats, no terms of surrender. They carried hellfire, and they were heading straight for the Zal Zerth homeworld. On Zal Zar, the capital world of the Zal Zerth Empire, the panic had reached its peak. The Emperor sat frozen on his throne, staring at the reports flooding in. Human ships approaching. All attempts at negotiation ignored. Orbital defenses prepared, but projected survival time, less than 1 hour. The Empire's mighty fleets were gone. Their warriors, the conquerors of 100 civilizations, had been turned to ash. And now, the humans were coming for the heart. The Emperor turned to his war council. "What do we do?" The words tasted of fear, a fear no Zal Zerth had ever known. No one answered, because there was nothing left to do. The human fleet arrived. Zalzar's orbital defenses opened fire the moment they appeared, a desperate last stand. The sky burned as anti-ship cannons unleashed torrents of plasma and kinetic rounds. Defense platforms rained nuclear-tipped missiles into the void. It didn't matter. Humanity had seen this before. For every shot fired, the Terran warships retaliated with 1,000. Dreadnought railguns shredded orbital stations before they could even lock onto a target. Swarms of drone bombers weaved through the chaos, reducing planetary defenses to smoldering craters. And then, the Purifiers entered position. A silence fell over the battlefield. Even the Zal Zerth defenders, those still alive, paused in horror. They had heard rumors, tales of planets reduced to cinders by human weapons. But surely even the humans wouldn't do this. And then came the transmission. Admiral Cain, staring down at the planet, his voice final and absolute. "This is the price." The Purifiers fired. The first impact shattered continents. A wave of energy unlike anything the Zal Zerth had ever seen erupted across their homeworld. Entire cities, once shining beacons of their empire, were vaporized in an instant. Oceans boiled into the sky, turning the atmosphere into a choking, burning wasteland. The emperor, watching from his palace, saw his people burning in the streets, screaming, running, falling, and then the second blast hit. Zalzar cracked. The very planet shook as tectonic plates split apart. Massive firestorms swept across the ruins of the Empire's greatest civilization. Those who had once been masters of the galaxy now choked on their own ashes. By the time the third purifier fired, Zalzar was no longer a world. It was a grave. The war was over. The Zal Zerth were no more. Not just their fleets, not just their warriors, their species. The Terran fleet remained in orbit for a moment longer, watching as the fires raged on what was once a homeworld. There were no celebrations, no cheers, only silence. Admiral Cain stood on the bridge of the Judicator, staring at the broken world below. His hands gripped the railing. His officers waited for his word. He gave none, because for all the righteousness of their cause, for all the justifications and vengeance, something dark had stirred in the soul of humanity that day, and the galaxy had felt it. For the first time in history, the other empires no longer saw humans as another species to dominate. They saw them for what they truly were, a species that did not forgive, a species that did not forget, a species that, when wronged, would burn entire civilizations to the ground. And somewhere, in the void, as the Terran fleet turned away from the ruined world behind them, the galaxy whispered in fear. Humanity had arrived, and they would never be underestimated again. The galaxy would never be the same again. For weeks after the fall of the Zal Zerth, an eerie silence hung over known space. No empire dared speak, no fleet dared move. The great powers that had once schemed and plotted over human colonies now waited, watching for what humanity would do next. The Varathi Dominion, whose warriors had once boasted of breaking human bones for sport, closed their borders overnight. The Kalath Syndicate, once thriving on human trafficking, purged every record of their dealings and quietly withdrew from the Galactic stage. The mighty Seraphi Concordat, who had dismissed humanity as a primitive species unworthy of diplomacy, now sent envoys to Earth, hoping, praying, to establish peace before it was too late. But humanity did not answer. Humanity was silent, and that silence was worse than any war. On Earth, the leaders of the Terran Federation gathered in secret. A war had been won, a species had been erased, and now a question hung over the highest ranks of the Federation, a question no one dared ask aloud. What are we now? Admiral Cain sat in the war room, staring at the star map before him. Zal Zerth space, once a vast, proud empire, was now a void. No signals, no transmissions, just darkness. Across the table, Grand Strategist Vera Lynn broke the silence. The Varathi are next. Cain didn't react. Lynn leaned forward, her voice measured, calculated. They were the first to test us. They enslaved our people. They burned our colonies. They cheered as our ships were destroyed. Now they're afraid. They've retreated. But fear fades. Memories fade. She locked eyes with Cain. If we stop here, if we let them recover, we'll fight this war again in 100 years. Cain's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. He had given the order to wipe out the Zal Zerth. He had watched as their homeworld burned, as their cities crumbled to nothing. He had made humanity's message clear. But now it was different. The Varathi were not the Zal Zerth. They had not invaded Earth. They had not burned New Avalon. They had enslaved humans, yes. They had fought against human colonies, yes. But they had never declared total war. Destroying them would not be vengeance. It would be conquest. And Cain wasn't sure if humanity was ready for that. Or worse, if they already were. He exhaled and stood. No. The word cut through the room like a blade. Lynn raised an eyebrow. No? Cain met her gaze. The war is over. We won. We don't need to become what they feared we were. Silence. Then a voice from the shadows. And what if we already have? All eyes turned to the doorway. A man stepped forward, tall, severe, his uniform black with no insignia. Director Elias Crow, the head of the Terran Intelligence Directorate, the man who had orchestrated the human response from the shadows. Crow stepped into the light, his eyes cold. You think the war is over? He let out a dry chuckle. No, Admiral. It has only just begun. Cain frowned. Explain. Crow turned to the star map, tapping a few controls. The image shifted. Suddenly, it wasn't just Varathi space, or Kalath Syndicate space, or Seraphi space. It was the entire galaxy. Highlighted in red, spanning hundreds of systems, was something Cain had never seen before. What is this? Cain asked, his voice low. Crow's lips curled into something resembling a smile. The truth, he said. This is what no one told you, Admiral. This is what the politicians were too afraid to reveal. This is why we were never supposed to stop at the Zal Zerth. Cain's jaw tightened. What the hell are you talking about? Crow stepped forward, his voice turning razor sharp. You thought the Zal Zerth were the enemy. You thought the Varathi were a threat. But they're nothing. They're just players in a game much larger than you imagined. He zoomed in. A black zone appeared at the edge of the galactic map. A place with no recorded history, no known empires. Just silence. Cain narrowed his eyes. What is that? Crow exhaled. The ones who are coming. A chill ran through the room. Even Lynn, ever composed, stiffened slightly. Cain folded his arms. Who? Crow's voice was grim. The Architects. The name sent a ripple of unease through the War Council. Cain had never heard it before, but the way the others reacted told him they had. He took a step forward. Explain. Crow's expression hardened. You think we won, Admiral, but we were never fighting for survival. He zoomed the map out further. More black zones appeared. Dozens, hundreds, entire sectors of the galaxy, empty, silent, dead. Crow's voice dropped to a whisper. We weren't fighting to live. We were fighting to prove we were worthy of it. The room went cold. Cain clenched his fists. Worthy of what? Crow turned to face him. Of existing. The silence was suffocating, and then the alarms blared. Cain turned to the holoscreen just as the message came through. Unidentified objects detected on the galactic rim. Massive energy signatures inbound. First contact imminent. Crow exhaled. They're here. Cain's blood ran cold, because in the depths of space, beyond the ruins of the Zal Zerth, something was coming. And this time, humanity wasn't fighting for revenge. They were fighting to survive. The Judicator's bridge was bathed in red light. Warning sirens screamed as incoming reports flooded the main holoscreen. Cain's mind raced as he took in the data. Unknown ships, unknown energy signatures. Every single reading was beyond anything recorded in known space. They weren't Varathi. They weren't Kalath. They weren't Seraphi. And worst of all, they weren't stopping. Cain turned to his comm officer. How far are they? 5 light-years out. They're not using FTL. Whatever they're doing, it's something else. Something faster. Cain's gut twisted. No empire had tech beyond the Terran Federation's FTL network. Not even the Seraphi, who had ruled the stars for millennia. Something faster than FTL? God help us. Crow stepped beside him, watching the screen with an unsettling calm. This is it. Cain clenched his jaw. You knew this was coming. Crow didn't deny it. We had suspicions. Cain turned sharply. And you didn't think we should have been informed? Crow met his glare with unreadable eyes. Would it have changed anything? Cain's fists tightened. He wanted to hit him. He wanted to grab Crow by the throat and demand why he had kept this secret. Why he had let them believe humanity was the apex predator of the stars when, all along, something else had been lurking. But there was no time for that now. Cain turned back to the holoscreen. Get me a visual. The sensor tech hesitated. Sir, we're receiving some strange interference. Cain's stomach twisted. Define strange. The tech swallowed. It's not blocking us. It's showing us something. The main screen flickered, and then it appeared. A transmission. Not words, not a message. A memory. Projected in eerie, crystalline clarity. A ruined galaxy. Stars burned out. Planets cracked open like eggs. Entire sectors of space ripped apart by forces beyond comprehension. A voice, cold, distant, inhuman, whispered through the bridge. You are young. The crew shuddered. Some clutched their heads as if something was pressing into their skulls. Cain grit his teeth as he forced himself to listen. You are reckless. The image shifted. Humanity's fleets. The war against the Zal Zerth. The burning of their homeworld. The death. The silence. You have proven your strength. You have proven your wrath. Another flicker. An image of Earth, of every human colony, millions, billions of lives. Now you will prove your worth. The screen went black. Cain's breathing was heavy. His heart pounded in his ears. He had never felt fear like this before. The comm officer looked up, pale as death. Sir, they're here. Cain turned slowly towards the viewport, and then he saw them. The ships were massive, monolithic, impossible. They moved without propulsion, without engines, without anything that should have allowed them to exist. And yet they were there. Hundreds, no, thousands, a fleet that made even the purifiers look like toys. Cain took a slow step forward. His voice was a whisper. My God. And then the largest of the ships, easily the size of a planet, began to open. Not like a hatch, not like a bay, like a mouth, a hungry, endless void. And Cain realized in that moment what the message had meant. This was not war. This was judgment. The architects had come, and humanity's true test had just begun. The silence before the storm was the worst part. Cain could feel it pressing against his skull, a silence that wasn't truly silence, as if something was watching, waiting, judging. Every breath he took felt heavier, like the very air had been weighed down by the presence of these things. The architects. That was what Crow had called them, a name spoken in hushed whispers in the deepest corridors of intelligence networks, a name that had never been recorded, never been acknowledged, because to acknowledge them meant accepting a terrible truth, that humanity was not at the top of the food chain, that there were forces out there, beyond empires, beyond gods. And now, those forces had come. Cain turned sharply to his tactical officer. Status on the fleet? The man was pale, but held his composure. Dreadnoughts holding formation. Escort squadron standing by. We are combat ready, sir. Cain exhaled. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Nothing could be combat ready for what loomed before them. All ships, raise shields. Do not fire unless fired upon. A quiet nod from the officer. The order rippled across the fleet. Thousands of warships, the greatest force humanity had ever assembled, held their position against something unknowable. The architects' fleet hung in the void, utterly silent. Their ships had no lights, no exhaust, no identifiable structure. They were shapes in the dark, as if they had been carved from the void itself. And then, a message, not sound, not transmission, something deeper, something that slipped into their minds like a whisper in a dream. One will answer. Cain felt the words more than he heard them. They coiled through his thoughts, their meaning absolute. Lynn stiffened beside him. They want an envoy. Cain exhaled slowly. He had known this moment was coming the second he had seen those ships. The architects were not here for war. Not yet. They were here to speak. And if the wrong words were spoken, if the wrong step was taken, this would end before it even began. Cain adjusted his uniform, straightened his posture, and took a deep breath. Patch me through. The bridge crew hesitated. No one wanted to be the one to do it. But after a few tense seconds, the comm officer swallowed hard and activated the transmission. The moment the connection was established, the world fell away. Cain was no longer on the bridge of the Judicator. He was somewhere else, floating, suspended, an endless expanse of shifting colors, light and darkness twining together in an impossible cosmic dance. And in the distance, so far yet impossibly near, they stood. Shapes, towering, silent, watching, the architects. Cain felt their presence wrap around him, their voices slipping into his mind, brushing against his thoughts like ancient fingers. You have been weighed, measured, tested. You have burned, you have slaughtered, you have taken the stars and claimed them as your own. The visions came in a flood. The war against the Zal Zerth, the purge of New Avalon, the ashes of civilizations left in humanity's wake. Cain clenched his fists. His mind screamed, but his body, if he even had one in this place, remained still. Do you understand what you are? Cain forced himself to breathe, and then, slowly, he spoke. We are survivors. The architects shifted, not in motion, not in shape, something deeper, and then survive. The visions ended. Cain slammed back into his own body on the bridge, gasping, sweat pouring down his face. His crew was shouting, their voices frantic. The architect's fleet was moving, but not forward. Away. Slowly, silently, as if retreating into the void from which they had come. The crew stood frozen, watching as the impossible warships vanished one by one. Cain let out a shuddering breath. We live. For now. But deep in his gut, he knew this was not the end. The architects had come not to destroy, but to see, to watch, to judge. And one day, they would return. And when they did, humanity would face a final test, a test that would decide whether they ruled the stars, or vanished into the dark like all the others before them. The war was over, but the game had just begun.